I began as a skeptic. As I started researching Da Vinci Code, I really thought I would disprove a lot of this theory about Mary Magdalene and holy blood and all of that. I became a believer. Whether you agree or disagree with the topics, they're on the table and we're talking about them. And these are topics that for centuries have been taboo.
You don't need to be the former highest paid author in history like Dan Brown to understand why people don't like sharing their political and religious opinions with others. The internet's long since exposed the general public's inability to civilly disagree, even with takes that have no real-world implications, much less entire belief systems that try to regulate the behaviors and aspirations of millions of lives. Regardless of subject matter, attempting to change someone else's mind is a thoroughly uncomfortable endeavor, one that most often only converts time and energy into mutual resentment. If everyone's already deeply entrenched in profoundly personal positions, why not just stick to talking about the milquetoast and inoffensive? Well, I think if the past decade has taught us anything, it's that ideological isolation can devastate a society. By conversing with the ancient people group we now call Generation X, I've learned that in the distant American past, everyone more or less received the same news that was marketed towards as wide a demographic as possible, thereby giving everyone the same reference point for which opinions constituted normalcy. There were only a handful of TV channels and newspapers that they could pick from that all relayed the same information in the exact same way.
Controlling exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
I don't need to tell you that those days are long gone. The 5 algorithms that control all of our lives now know more about us than we know about ourselves, and are willing to show us harmful or misleading content if doing so will keep our eyes gorilla glued to their platforms. Given our increasing alienation from sources seeking to tell us the objective truth and people that disagree with us, it's no longer appropriate to ask whether any given modern individual is misinformed. Instead, the question lies with the extent of our immersion into various types of rabbit holes, insulated bubbles, and downward spirals whose dishonesty has been made all the more efficient thanks to developments in AI. Your uncle isn't capable of telling whether these images are real or not. He and millions of others like him have been involuntarily subjugated to a future of, at best, perpetual suspicion and uncertainty, or, more likely, ignorant conformity to truth-agnostic slop. While I've seen plenty of people talk about the negative effects we're experiencing from an increase in political misinformation, hardly anyone is discussing the parallel problems occurring in the other area of thought most foreign to polite conversation. Some less than altruistic religious leaders have begun telling their congregations to give them millions in cryptocurrency. This guy's apocalyptic prediction went viral on TikTok, prompting some to sell their possessions or max out their credit cards. Like the plethora of other false religious claims throughout history, these examples show why the religious variants of misinformation are particularly destructive. The sheer volume of competing perspectives and incompatible assertions can make discerning the truth of even falsifiable religious claims an extremely disorienting process. We know for a fact that Jesus was crucified on a Roman cross 2,000 years ago, but you'd never learn that by speaking to a Jehovah's Witness or a practitioner of fundamentalist Islam. Since properly evaluating each of the endless number of worldviews would be as onerous as it would be exhausting, most people are content to adopt a generalization of the field that allows them to avoid having to fact-check their beliefs. If every perspective has a bit correct, a bit of corruption, and a bit of the absurd, hyper-fixating on whether you or others believe false things pertaining to religion would be a colossal waste of time. Those who spread religious misinformation take advantage of this truth-agnostic complacency. Their claims, as we'll soon see, often encourage the public to ignore the religious dialogue of the past in favor of their own new ideas. Ideas that typically aren't very difficult to disprove, but successfully spread regardless, because most people find parsing through religious fact and fiction to be too much of a hassle, because we don't want to talk with others about religion. Religious misinformation is especially difficult to correct when the disputed claim is supported by some sort of higher authority. No amount of quotations of ancient Roman historians will ever be persuasive to those convinced the Watchtower organization or the Quran are products of an omniscient deity. I suspect upon hearing that, many of you who aren't religious will be tempted to feel immune to this kind of misinformation. If someone told me to give them money in the name of God, you think, I'd tell them to eat my shorts. If that sounds like you, I'd invite you to expand the scope of our upcoming discussion a bit. This video won't have much to say about misinformation believed by religious people. Let's say, hypothetically, someone who isn't religious were to claim that you and the general public have been thoroughly misled about the life of Jesus Christ, that no existing religious group is teaching the truth about him. This person's done an incredible amount of research that's uncovered suppressed history, making them capable of properly assessing religious truth claims, and they're willing to teach you this truth, to distinguish between the fact and the fiction on your behalf in exchange for a few of your dollars. If that were to happen, would you buy it? Dan Brown's current life circumstances couldn't be any more different than they were at the beginning of his career. The first decade of his professional writing yielded him little financial success. If he wasn't working 2 teaching jobs on the side, he wouldn't have been able to pay his rent. After his 4th novel, The Da Vinci Code, hit shelves in 2003, Dan Brown never had to worry about coming up with rent money ever again. This book was impossibly successful. It sold 85 million copies, making it the 9th best-selling non-sacred text of all time. Most of the books that take the #1 spot on the New York Times bestseller list usually only retain that title for about a week or two. The Da Vinci Code's held that spot 59 times, over a month more than any other hardcover fiction book ever has. It's made the bestseller list 165 times, 136 of which were done consecutively. It launched a series with several more novels and a movie trilogy starring Tom Hanks that grossed $1.6 billion. There was a Da Vinci Code stage play. It was adapted into a PS2 game that sold dozens of copies.
What do you think about the use of his own blood as ink?
Obviously, he had nothing else to write with.
In spite of all of this success, there's a good chance that those of you who were born after or shortly before this book's release date have never even heard of it. I only found out about it because my religious studies professors at college frequently mentioned it. As I started learning more about the novel in preparation for this video, I was completely floored to see that this book that nobody talks about, that's completely vanished from the cultural zeitgeist, outsold 6 of the 7 Harry Potter books. Unlike the Harry Potter series, Dan Brown's series of mysteries starring Detective Robert Langdon wasn't able to maintain overwhelming financial success or cultural relevance over a long period of time. The book that preceded the Da Vinci Code in the series retroactively performed well, and the 3rd book saw similar success, but none of the subsequent 3 novels have come anywhere close to matching the incredible sales numbers of their predecessors. We see the same trend with the Robert Langdon movies. The Da Vinci Code grossed over $800 million, more than the next 2 in the series combined. Because the 3rd movie financially underperformed, the next Dan Brown adaptation was made for a streaming service and also financially underperformed. The stories themselves haven't gotten any worse over time, people have just stopped caring about them. While Dan Brown might have been able to garner an audience and make it as a writer had he never written the Da Vinci Code, I think the public's lack of interest in his other work gives us good reason to credit all the success he's since enjoyed to just the one title. When readers saw that the main draw of the text, its sole remaining cultural contribution, was absent from his other books and movies, they stopped caring about his work. His audience was primarily interested in his religious misinformation.
The novel's immense popularity is easily explained. Most people believe they're getting more than just a good yarn.
Although retailers list the Da Vinci Code as a work of fiction, Dan Brown's done everything in his power to convince his readers that its story accurately reflects history. Any reader who attempts to begin the story will be quickly confronted with a list of facts, insisting that the artwork, architecture, documents, and secret rituals in the novel are all accurately presented. Dan made even stronger assertions throughout his press tour for the book in 2003. He told one interviewer that he wouldn't have written the novel differently if it were a non-fiction title, that he suspected his research would disprove the alleged facts that his story would go on to contain, but that numerous research trips to Europe informed his perspective and made him into a believer. The history of Christianity presented in the Da Vinci Code simply made more sense to him than the version he was taught as a child. In an interview with CNN, he claimed that 99% of his book, including all of the history and background information, was true. He fabricated the characters, of course, but nothing more. The book, the movie, and Dan's interviews all try to leave onlookers with the impression that they, like Dan, have stumbled onto something big, something powerful people don't want you to know about. The fact sheet informs us of the existence of a medieval secret society that Isaac Newton and Leonardo da Vinci both served. It warns us about a brainwashing, coercive, dangerous Catholic sect that's probably quite miffed the fruits of Dan Brown's research have exposed their secrets to the public. Throughout the story, Robert Langdon himself discovers these secrets, that the earliest records of Jesus' life, called Gospels, depict him not as a divine figure, but only as an impressive man, one who was married to the biblical side character, Mary Magdalene.
I
Magdalene was Jesus' wife.
While Jesus viewed Mary Magdalene as his most impressive spiritual disciple, the early Christian movement refused to be led by a woman after Jesus' crucifixion and fervently tried to kill Mary. She was forced to flee from the Middle East to France to avoid her husband's bloodthirsty followers, where she gave birth in peace to a baby named Sarah, Jesus' biological daughter, whose descendants would go on to rule France and make up the Merovingian dynasty. Centuries later, the growth of Christianity within the Roman Empire upset the pre-existing pagan population, causing widespread civil unrest. To prevent his empire from collapsing, the pagan emperor Constantine held the Council of Nicaea, a gathering of religious elites who would together craft an official state religion that would unify the Roman people. They voted on which of the 80 gospel accounts of Jesus' life would be included in the Bible, while appointing any source that contradicted their new orthodoxy for destruction. Nicene Christianity would go unchallenged for several more centuries until the reign of the French king Godefroy de Bouillon, who conquered Jerusalem during the Crusades. In his attempt to find the legendary Holy Grail, a chalice that allegedly contained the blood of Jesus, he stumbled across documents that had recorded Jesus' bloodline through Mary and the location of her sarcophagus. This discovery led him to founding the Priory of Sion, the secret society we discussed earlier, composed of famous intellectuals and artists whose mission was to collect the proof relating to the Holy Grail, which was actually Mary Magdalene the entire time, and protect the living descendants of Jesus via their military arm, the Knights Templar. Over the next 200 years, the Knights Templar obtained incredible amounts of wealth and power by blackmailing the Vatican, which prompted Pope Clement and French King Philippe IV to arrest and assassinate as many of them as they could on Friday, October 13th, 1307, which is why we think Friday the 13th is unlucky. The remaining members of the Priory went into hiding and continued their mission underground while engaging in bizarre occult sex rituals. Leonardo da Vinci would eventually become a Grandmaster of the Priory and choose to paint commissions for the Roman Catholic Church because of the sadistic enjoyment he derived from hiding pagan symbols in their holy iconography, including painting Mary Magdalene herself into the Last Supper while putting a V-shape, the universal symbol of the sacred feminine, in between her and Jesus.
Oh, and Robert, notice what happens when these two figures change position.
By the time the year 2003 rolls around, most of the members of the Priory have been killed off by the fundamentalist Catholic sect Opus Dei, who indoctrinated an albino escaped convict and subsequently instructed him to hunt down and kill the last of the Priory, while his evil mastermind priest framed Robert Langdon for murder. He made it all up. Dan Brown claimed that the history in his book was all true, but he was lying. Virtually every detail in the narrative I just provided you is wrong. Prior to a plagiarism lawsuit, Dan Brown had a list of over 30 books on his website that he promoted as supplemental reading for the Da Vinci Code, with the implication being that these were the historical sources that made him a believer, that convinced him that a secret society in the Christian church have spent the past 1,000 years concealing secret knowledge of Jesus' living bloodline. Only a handful of them were written by actual academics, with most of Brown's ideas coming from these two books, written by people with no academic training in history or religion whatsoever. The Priory of Sion, the organization most of the book's plot is dependent upon, didn't form in the year 1099, as is stated in Dan's list of facts.
Fact, the Priory of Sion really exists. That's not true.
No, it certainly doesn't exist as it's described in the Da Vinci Code. It was formed in the 50s by a French embezzler and con man, and that's pretty much the history of the Priory of Sion.
And Opus Dei can't possibly be an evil sect of secretive, powerful, monastic Catholic priests because they aren't a monastic organization. Their membership is entirely made up of lay people.
We don't have any monks in Opus Dei. We're a lay organization.
You might be tempted to think that I'm overstating things here. This is a Christian YouTube channel after all, one that asks its viewers to subscribe that the powers which wage war against their souls might grieve with sadness, knowing that 2 loud subscribers will be watching more high-quality Christian content in the future. I'm clearly not some unbiased third party. Perhaps in my offense at this heterodox view of Jesus, I'm overlooking some of Dan's compelling points about Constantine, Nicaea, or early Christianity. Maybe the truth is more complicated than I'm leading others to believe. While I think the rest of this video will make it flagrantly apparent that Dan Brown is as much a historian as I am a brain surgeon, it's worth noting that no professor of history or religion thinks that Dan Brown's historical narrative is rooted in reality. A brief investigation investigation conducted on this very platform would yield you with lectures from both Christian and non-Christian academics just going to town, repeating over and over that the Da Vinci Code was entirely a product of Dan Brown's imagination.
There are some statements that are, you just wonder why he says them, because they add nothing to the plot, really, and they're absolutely wrong. For example, one of the statements that gets made repeatedly is that among the recent discoveries of ancient documents is the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is true, which contain some of the earliest accounts of Jesus. What? The Dead Sea Scrolls have nothing to do with Jesus.
And as much fun as it is to point out that Dan Brown was wrong when he claimed that the Mona Lisa was a self-portrait of Leonardo da Vinci in drag, I don't find that to be the aspect of this story most worthy of investigation. A broke teacher lied once he realized that doing so would get him a super mega ultra chocolatey fudge coated sized fortune. If that's all the Da Vinci Code was made to achieve, then neither Dan's lies nor his motivation for telling them would be compelling enough for me to want to keep talking about them. No. It's worth our time to examine the Da Vinci Code even 20 years after its release, because it's, start to finish, a work of anti-Christian propaganda, and was able to persuade millions of people to believe it's religious misinformation.
They determined that something like 40% of all people who've read the book in Canada believe that the historical claims are true.
Its story isn't interested in being charitable towards Christians or their history, with its fabrication servicing an unrelenting effort to portray both in as bad a light as possible. Outside of some protests from 20 years ago, I haven't seen anyone acknowledge how crazy it is that the 9th best-selling book of all time was an intentional bad faith work of slander against the Christian religion. While the general public might not remember its characters or its author, the sentiment the Da Vinci Code sought to instill within its readers and the fiction masquerading as history it used to accomplish that are still around and deserve to be critiqued for what they are: extensions of Dan Brown's intentionally uninformed contempt of Christianity. The first idea the Da Vinci Code wants us to accept is that Christian history exposes the faith as being obviously false, meaning its practitioners arrive at their beliefs solely through delusion. Shortly after Detective Langdon obtains a cryptex with information about the Holy Grail, he seeks out a friend of his who's an expert on early Christianity, British historian Sir Lee Teabing. Teabing is the character through whom Brown positions most of his historical nonsense as fact. His words aren't couched in theory or caveated in any way. He tells us plainly that Christianity as we know it was invented 300 years after the life of Jesus at the Council of Nicaea. Almost everything people think they know about Jesus is wrong, and any historian who spent time studying him is vividly aware of this.
Jesus was viewed by many of his followers as a mighty prophet, as a great and powerful man, but a man, nevertheless, a mortal man.
Not the Son of God?
Not even his nephew twice removed.
Hold on. You're saying Jesus' divinity came from a vote?
He goes on to claim that modern clergy are aware of documents that prove Jesus wasn't God, but that they arbitrarily ignore them, deeming them false testimony. Constantine's Bible has been their truth for ages. Nobody is more indoctrinated than the indoctrinator. Nobody in the book ever questions Teabing's assertions. They do get a bit of pushback from Langdon in the movie, but the viewer isn't ever given a reason to think this comes from an informed or consequential perspective. The dialogue feels as if it were added in response to criticism of the novel coming from people like me.
This is an old wives' tale.
The original one, in fact.
There's virtually no empirical proof.
He knows as well as I do. There's much evidence to support it.
Theories. There are theories.
There are several more instances throughout the story where Christianity appears to be overwhelmingly false. The French investigation into the Holy Grail yielded irrefutable proof of Jesus' bloodline. The captain of the French police performed no due diligence investigation after his priest accused Detective Langdon of murder. He'd have believed anything his priest told him because Christians are happy to believe things without evidence. If Dan Brown had spent any amount of time talking to the non-Christian scholars of Jesus in the early church, it would have become immediately apparent that the evidence against Christianity and their reasons for not adhering to the faith look nothing like the way they're depicted in his story. Many of them don't believe for reasons that have nothing to do with history. They find philosophical or metaphysical objections like the incompatibility of a good God with the evil we see in our world, or a strict naturalism to be so compelling, they assume Jesus couldn't have been God or risen from the dead prior to investigating any historical source.
I finally became an agnostic for reasons unrelated to my scholarship. reason having to do with why there's suffering in the world if there's a God who's in control.
The ones who do object to Christianity purely on historical grounds generally do so either because they think there's less external evidence for the history in the Bible than we would expect to find if it were accurate, and or because they think that the record of events internal to the Bible mixes real history with legendary developments. None of them hold their position because of documents that prove Jesus isn't God, because no such documents exist. That's a big reason why there are fully credentialed historians who work at secular universities, publish in academic journals, have spent decades critically exploring the life of Jesus in early Christianity, who are nonetheless fully convinced that Jesus is God. One of the most famous texts covering what we can assert historically about the life of Jesus was written by an Anglican bishop who's currently a senior research fellow at Oxford. If today, good faith intelligent people can arrive at different conclusions regarding the truth of Christianity through subjective interpretation, why didn't Dan Brown choose to argue that the interpretations offered by non-Christians are better? There are lots of people who don't like Christianity and spend a lot of time debating against it by doing exactly that. Why did Dan Brown feel the need to pull from his imagination when he could have just taken from the best arguments already in existence? Well, because Dan Brown didn't come to conclusions about Christian history based on his research, as he repeatedly claimed, but instead did the inverse. He was comfortable relying on bad sources, treating an invented history as irrefutable fact because he assumed from the outset that Christianity was obviously false. The Da Vinci Code's complete dismissal of religious thought was pretty common in the early 2000s, as can be seen in the infamous post-9/11 New Atheism movement, headlined by four well-spoken, well-educated individuals who advocated for the end of religious practice. As was the case with Dan Brown, 3 of the 4 horsemen of New Atheism had no formal education on the subject and weren't very familiar with the faiths they criticized, yet felt qualified to speak authoritatively about them regardless, leading to repeated mischaracterizations of theological doctrines and strawmanning of religious argumentation.
I love Richard, and I spent a lot of time with him and I respect him a lot. I tell this story sometimes of when I saw him in a car park. I'd said to him that the God delusion I felt didn't adequately deal with a particular argument.
Sure.
And he said to me later, he said to me at this event, he was like, hey, what could I have done? And I said, well, you treat all kinds of causation as if they're the same thing. And he says, well, do you think there are different kinds of causation? I said, I do. And then I sort of spent about 30 to 60 seconds trying to explain what I thought the difference was, to which he said, but what the fuck has that got to do with anything interesting? Thank God I'm not a theologian. And then he walked away.
While New Atheism would peak in popularity in the years following the Da Vinci Code's publication, its underlying ideas were already being spread while Dan Brown was in the process of writing the story.
Religion is corrosive to science. It teaches them to accept authority, revelation, and faith instead of always insisting on evidence.
Dan Brown applied the same attitude the New Atheists were applying to religion as a whole to his interpretation of Christian history. Jesus must have been a man, which means he probably had a wife and children, which means modern Christianity must have been invented hundreds of years later. That, as is expressed in this comment underneath the Da Vinci Code's YouTube rental, certainly makes more sense than the version of Christian events taught by modern Christian organizations, meaning it's on the table.
They're on the table, and we're talking about them.
The Christians who disagree must be ignorant or stupid or lying, having been deceived by groups acting in bad faith while suppressing the truth. The priests who attended the Council of Nicaea didn't discuss the topics that appear in the 55th chapter of the Da Vinci Code. They didn't change their day of worship to Sunday to accommodate a sun cult, or set a date for Christmas that would fuse Christian holidays with pagan ones, or discuss which books would make it into the Bible.
Constantine had nothing to do with the formation of the canon of the New Testament.
And they certainly didn't vote on the divinity of Jesus Christ.
It's not true that the council decided that Jesus was divine. Everybody who went to the council, and virtually every other Christian in the entire world at the time, knew that Jesus was divine.
It's not difficult to prove that belief in Jesus' divinity dates back to the 1st century. Paul, a Christian convert from Judaism, wrote a letter to the church in Philippi around the year 60 AD, stating that explicitly. He said that Jesus existed in the form of God prior to his incarnation, and every tongue will eventually acknowledge him as Lord. Other texts in the Bible written later state this even more dramatically. Thomas calls Jesus his God at the end of the Gospel of John. Paul's letter to the Colossians says that Jesus was a co-participant with God the Father in every aspect of creation and holds creation together. In Revelation, Jesus identifies himself as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, and is said to be the one to judge humanity at the end of time. Anyone who tells you that no one claimed Jesus was divine prior to the Council of Nicaea, or that Constantine elevated Jesus to his divine status, clearly hasn't ever read the New Testament. You don't need to believe that Jesus was divine yourself to see that other people clearly thought that well before 325 AD. It's just indisputably wrong to say otherwise. The Council of Nicaea addressed a handful of issues much more trivial than the ones attributed to it in the Da Vinci Code after settling a dispute about the nature of Jesus's divinity. Is he a lesser deity that was created by the Father as taught by Arius, or is he co-equal and co-eternal with the Father as taught by Alexander of Alexandria? After consulting the biblical text and hearing an Arian priest claim that Jesus isn't true God, it became obvious to the council which verdict was correct.
The book says that there was a very close vote at the council. Well, the actual vote on that issue was something like about 327 to about 4 or 5.
Outside of Jesus' marriage to Mary Magdalene, the deception at Nicaea is the most important piece of exposition in the story. Dan dedicates significant time to it both in print and on screen, and it couldn't be written out of the narrative without the entire story undergoing significant alterations. Without the Council of Nicaea stealing and merging ideas from the pagan Roman society that surrounded them, the reader or viewer wouldn't have justification to believe that Christianity introduced no original ideas into the world.
Nominate for me one thing, just one thing, that Christianity has introduced that doesn't have some source, some parallel, some analogy in previous and in other civilizations, in thinking about anything, ethical, metaphysical, anything you like. And I must say, I've racked my brains over this, and I cannot think of one. I would love to hear if there is one.
Absolutely. I think the ideal of lifelong matrimony, the notion of secularism, the idea of there being religions, the concept of science as it emerges in the 19th century.
Maybe you're skeptical of the historians like Tom Holland who attribute nearly all of the moral improvement between modern Western society and their savage Roman predecessors to Christianity while dressing up in a red suit and swinging around rooftops. That's perfectly fine for this discussion, so long as you can agree that Christianity brought to the world new ideas of any kind, good or bad. Your stance is meaningfully different than the one that Dan Brown would like you to adopt. If we can't say that the Virgin Mary or baby Jesus are just like Isis and Horus, they 100% aren't, by the way. If we can't say that the date of Christmas or Jesus being given gold, frankincense, and myrrh, or Christians worshiping on a Sunday, if there's a single aspect of the Christian faith that was in any way innovative or revolutionary, that would require an explanation, a moment of our thoughts, reflection, however brief, on if Christianity might have introduced something good or beautiful into the world. Dan Brown simply can't allow that. Christianity is bad. The only reason so many people are convinced otherwise is because they don't know that the things they find so meaningful in it were actually completely plagiarized. The Council of Nicaea proves that educated Christians know this and always have. They know that their faith is a jerry-rigged house of cards whose toppling has only been prevented by the continual, organized, active suppression of their real history. My problem here isn't with the Da Vinci Code portraying Christians doing bad things. Many people throughout history have claimed to be following Jesus while doing the most degenerate things you can think of, and there are plenty of real-world examples of Christian organizations conspiring that Dan Brown could have opted to write about instead. One of my next videos is going to cover the life of the founder of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, who frequently rewrote his own history and acted violently towards the people who called him out for doing so. Powerful religious leaders often do conspire, and there's nothing inherently wrong with finding that captivating or wanting to explore that through fiction. But if Dan Brown had stopped there, he wouldn't have had to lie about the Council of Nicaea. People would be able to interpret the evil done by the self-proclaimed Christians in his story as a deviation or corruption from what Christianity is supposed to bring about. This is especially the case in the movie, which asks us to look at Opus Dei brainwashing a vulnerable man into becoming a killer, instructing him to harm himself to atone for his sins, and unwaveringly committing to kill those who know about the descendants of Jesus, including the descendants themselves, and call all of that genuinely Christian behavior. If no Christian organization, past or present, has promoted their beliefs in good faith, if they only care about preserving the power they've wrongfully accumulated, we would be foolish to stop and consider anything they have to say, especially those of us who are being oppressed by Christianity. At the climax of the story, Lee Teabing reveals that he desperately wants to obtain the documents containing the genealogies of Jesus' descendants and has been manipulating both Detective Langdon and Opus Dei in order to get his hands on them. He wants to use these documents to prove to the world that Jesus Christ married Mary Magdalene, thereby causing a worldwide apostasy from Christianity that would put an end to the oppression he believes the Vatican exerts over its members.
All the oppression of the poor and the powerless, of those of different skin, of women, you can put an end to all that.
Mr. Teabing, sir, what on God's green earth are you talking about? You told us earlier that you and every other historian are 100% confident that Jesus married Mary Magdalene, and you proved this to us by using gospel narratives you said were more reliable than the ones in the Bible.
Now, listen to this. It's from the Gospel according to Philip.
Philip?
Yes, it was rejected at the Council of Nicaea, and the companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples.
The reason you haven't been able to convince Christians of this has nothing to do with the lack of proof, but because they've blindly rejected any evidence you've shown them that doesn't support their faith, bought into the greatest story ever sold. Getting some new documents won't change the current historical consensus or persuade those already committed to denying reality. Mr. Teabing, put down the gun. Your plan doesn't make any sense. That's what I would have said had Teabing held me at gunpoint. Detective Langdon didn't happen to point any of that out in the actual story. You might be tempted to think that Teabing being revealed to be a villain is meant to critique his earlier ideas. Teabing says he hates the violent schemes the Catholic Church uses to maintain their power, but is willing to enact his own violent schemes to get what he wants. His hypocrisy should lead us to question everything he has to say. The problem with interpreting Teabing this way is that the narrative itself confirms and agrees with pretty much everything he says throughout the story. Langdon finds the genealogies that Teabing was looking for. Mary Magdalene's sarcophagus is shown to be deep beneath the foundations of the Louvre. Christian leadership was willing to do terrible things to keep people from discovering Jesus' marriage and venerating the divine feminine. No, from Dan Brown's perspective, Teabing wasn't wrong about Christians or Christianity. His only fatal flaw was stooping to their level, acting like a Christian in order to stop them.
All the oppression of the poor, of those of different skin.
I'm really not sure why he brought up skin color here. While it's very true that throughout American history, people have tried to use Christianity to justify racial prejudice, there's nothing in the Bible itself that gave them any warrant to do that. That becomes immediately apparent when you start looking at global Christianity. Before the rise of Islam, Northern Africa was a central hub of Christian thought and produced many saints of darker skin colors. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, founded in the 4th century, is still going strong well over 1,000 years later. In Acts chapter 8, Philip baptized an Ethiopian official into the Christian faith without implying in any way that he was some kind of second-class Christian. Jesus wanted his followers to spread Christianity to every nation of the world because he thought each of them was equally qualified to receive it. Teabing's charge of racism rings hollow because it comes out of nowhere. The story never dedicates any time to showing us why it's a dire problem, unlike the extensive treatment given to the Christians' oppression of the sacred feminine. The Priory of Sion taught that Constantine's corrupted Christianity supplanted the matriarchal paganism that had previously dominated the world. A campaign of propaganda demonized the sacred feminine, obliterating the goddess from modern religion forever. According to Teabing, Christians have been doing this since the time of Jesus. A look through the unaltered Gospels shows that the disciple Peter stole Jesus' movement away from Mary Magdalene, who Jesus, the original feminist, intended to be his successor. Modern Christian leaders continue to oppress women in part by downplaying the role of Mary Magdalene in the early Christian movement, preventing her from receiving the worship she rightfully deserves. So even if the Da Vinci Code were 100% correct about everything it says about Mary Magdalene, the framing of this critique would still boggle my mind. The Da Vinci Code never acknowledges the existence of Protestantism. All of the Christians in its story are Catholic, and Teabing's plan to take down the church seems to be referring to the one led by the Vatican specifically. Dan Brown wants us to believe that the Catholic Church, the one that venerates the more famous Mary from the Bible above every other human being save Jesus Christ, is desperate to keep their followers away from the sacred feminine. I find that impossible to believe. Moreover, everything the story says about the Gospels, including what it says about Mary Magdalene, is wrong.
By about the year 180 or so, prominent church leaders throughout Christendom were claiming that the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the only Gospels to be accepted as Scripture. This happened 140 years before Constantine. You need to understand, I'm not saying this for religious reasons. I'm talking simply as a historian without any religious axe to grind on this particular point. The Gospels of the New Testament are our earliest and best historical records of what Jesus said and did.
Because there weren't countless people documenting what Jesus said and did like the Da Vinci Code would lead us to believe, we don't have any written account of the life of Jesus that predates the Gospels in the New Testament. Because the early church fervently copied and spread these 4 Gospels, we've been able to reconstruct their original wording to a degree of precision that's leagues higher than pretty much any other ancient text. Don't get me wrong, there are still edge cases, but no major Christian doctrine is in jeopardy because of them. Dan was wrong to assume that translations, additions, and revisions have altered the original wording of the Gospels beyond repair, wording that barely mentions Mary Magdalene.
You could put on a 3x5 card what we know about Mary Magdalene.
No one wrote her out of the story of Jesus. She just wasn't in it that much to begin with. As far as the Gospels outside of the New Testament are concerned, 1, none of them mention Mary Magdalene being married to Jesus. As far as I can tell, the early Mormon Church was the first group to even suggest such a thing, which they did 1800 years after the life of Jesus. 2, all of them were written later than the New Testament Gospels, meaning they don't provide an unaltered view into the life of Jesus and aren't used by historians for that purpose. And 3, they don't demonstrate a higher view of women than the one found in the Bible. Many of them were created by a group called the Gnostics, who believed that our physical world was an evil creation of an ignorant or evil god called the Demiurge, who was born outside of the divine realm due to the carelessness of his mother goddess, Sophia. Gnostic Jesus was sent by the highest god called the Monad to help humanity discover their dormant spark of divinity via secret knowledge that, once learned, would free them from being shackled to the evil physical world. The problem they encountered when trying to spread their message, of course, was that none of those ideas appear in the first century Gospels or had any way of being traced back to Jesus himself. A problem they tried to solve by pseudepigraphically writing Gospels that, in the words of Dan Brown, put their ideas on the table by depicting Jesus as offering secret knowledge to biblical side characters and proclaiming that whichever of them happened to have their name at the beginning of the text was his most favorite person in the whole wide world and definitely someone you should trust more than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mary Magdalene's gospel was a block of cheese on the mousetrap of a cult that didn't have a high view of women. The Gospel of Thomas ends with Peter telling Gnostic Jesus that women aren't worthy of life. And instead of responding with, "Hey Peter, that's not true," Gnostic Jesus promises to lead Mary Magdalene into becoming a man before agreeing that women who don't become men are barred from entrance into heaven. This is the original feminist Jesus that Dan Brown was referring to. In the Gnostic creation myth, the first woman, Eve, is created as a byproduct of an angel's attempt to remove a spark of the divine feminine called epinoia out of the first man, Adam. While Eve goes on to be given her own divine spark, she has it almost immediately taken away from her by the same divine realm that would go on to send Gnostic Jesus and never gets it back, hence the need for women to become like men in spirit in order to escape physical reality. This idea of the masculine nature being ontologically superior to its feminine counterpart was prevalent all throughout the ancient world. Aristotle taught that women were physically deformed men who had been conceived incorrectly. The courts of Second Temple Judaism assumed the testimony of women to be unreliable and would only allow it to be admissible in a narrow range of circumstances. Christianity, far from inventing a new system of patriarchy, offered women, and specifically poor lower-class women, a level of dignity otherwise unobtainable in the rest of the Roman Empire, as can be seen in the life of Mary of Bethany. Jesus saw her as fit to receive his teaching and commended her decision to seek it out over doing housework. He went out of his way to say that she wasn't an inherently subservient person. She would go on to receive even more approbation from Jesus prior to his crucifixion. While his male disciples were busy telling him that his prediction regarding his imminent death was wrong, Mary of Bethany poured out a jar of perfume worth more than a year's wages on Jesus in preparation for his burial. Something Jesus appreciated so much, he promised that her act of devotion would be memorialized throughout the world. When writing the Da Vinci Code, Dan Brown wasn't aware that Mary Magdalene and Mary of Bethany were two completely different people. Mary Magdalene is famous for being the first to witness and converse with the resurrected Jesus and tell the 12 disciples that he was alive. Jesus thought it was appropriate for her and the other women who stayed with him throughout his crucifixion to get to witness his resurrection before the guys who abandoned him prior to his death. Now, if the Jewish historian Josephus had heard Mary Magdalene claim to have seen a man rise from the dead, he would have called her hysterical. Contrast contrast that attitude with Jesus' expectation that Mary's testimony of his resurrection be seen as valid. There isn't historical evidence of the early church slandering Mary Magdalene, but there is good reason to believe they did the opposite. Thought it was important to tell as many people as they could that she saw Jesus rise from the dead, and that she was telling the truth. If Dan Brown hadn't assumed from the get-go that Christianity's contributed nothing to the world, he might have encountered Galatians 3:26 through 29, a passage declaring that anyone who clothes themselves with Christ, regardless of race, sex, or culturally assigned worth, shares in the same baptism, is of equal worth to Jesus Christ, and is adopted into the family of God, and heir to the promises of resurrection, eternal life, and glorification. It was Christianity's unique ability to fight for the oppressed, to insist upon their dignity and worth, that caused the faith's critics to label it a religion for slaves and women.
All the oppression of the poor, of women, you can put an end to all that.
This criticism would have been entirely foreign to a pre-Christian Roman Empire that took the strong's right to oppress the weak as an inalienable element of natural law. It's only because of Christianity's effort to give hope to the hopeless, to enforce the flattening of social hierarchies, that Dan Brown is today able to take such an effort for granted, be completely unaware that it ever transpired while advocating for the abolition of its source. Or at least, that's what one would think would be the conclusion of someone who's extensively lied to get us to believe that Christianity is bad. But the worldview we see in the Da Vinci Code's finale, the worldview that Dan Brown would most like us to adopt, doesn't want to go there. At the beginning of the movie, Detective Langdon is working his day job, giving a lecture on symbology to his class at Harvard, a field of study that doesn't actually exist. He zooms in on pictures of religious imagery and prompts the class to interpret their meaning, which they do very confidently and very incorrectly.
Now, this symbol, anyone?
Evil. La fourche du diable.
In English, please.
Devil's pitchfork.
Poor Poseidon. That is his trident. Now, this symbol.
Madonna and Child. Faith. Christianity.
No, it's a pagan god Horus and his mother Isis centuries before the birth of Christ. How do we sift truth from belief? How do we penetrate years, centuries of historical distortion to find original truth?
It's pretty obvious what the movie is trying to do here, right? It's laying the groundwork for its later accusations of Christian plagiarism, while telling the viewer outright that they need to be more critical in their observations and assessment of religion. I don't think the movie does that particularly well. I would have never guessed this image to be satanic, but the kids in the movie do, so that's clearly what the scene is trying to accomplish. Mary and the devil evoke strong reactions from Langdon's students. They compel people to love and hate. They alter what we think about good and evil. The revelation that they're, in actuality, reinterpretations of beings and ideas that we don't find compelling at all is supposed to nullify those feelings and any other influence they could have on what we think, say, or do. Throughout its story, the Da Vinci Code attempts to apply the methodology of this scene in its unveiling of the truth about Jesus. Mary Magdalene's inclusion in the story feels so sloppy and creates so many internal inconsistencies within the narrative because it's not really about her. If her being married to Jesus and bearing his child didn't, as Teabing put it, undermine the critical notion of Christ's divinity, she wouldn't have been included in the story at all. Dan Brown would have found some other way to show his audience that Jesus isn't God. Langdon's deconstruction of Jesus differs from those in his lecture in that he doesn't want us to completely dismiss him. The story as a whole states as fact that Jesus was a great and powerful man who lived a majestic life and inspired millions. It, like the many, many non-Christian interpretations of him, ignores everything he had to say about the consequences of human sin, the need to be born again, the pervasive rejection of God on our planet, and the impending divine judgment that will bind many souls to eternal conscious torment, in favor of a much more palatable Jesus whose worldview is generally compatible with whatever the interpreter happens to already believe. When making his Jesus, Dan Brown wasn't being restricted by any sources. The Gnostic Gospels he claimed to be referencing don't portray Jesus as being human at all. Every detail we get about Jesus in the Da Vinci Code is there solely to convince us of what Dan Brown wants us to believe about him. He could have elected to make his Jesus just as mythical as Isis or Poseidon, but intentionally chose to make him a historical figure. When it's revealed that Sophie, the character I've so far neglected to mention who traveled with Detective Langdon throughout the entire story, is a descendant of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, she, like us, isn't quite sure what she's supposed to do with that information. When Langdon says,
"Why does it have to be human or divine?" Maybe human is divine. Why couldn't Jesus have been a father and still been capable of all those miracles?
Sophie laughs it off. She tries to walk on water just to see if she can, but quickly realizes she isn't able to. If this story didn't have a villain, we might be able to interpret this as an open-ended conclusion, one that isn't concerned with how we should implement Dan Brown's Jesus into our lives. But given that Lee Teabing's application of Jesus is shown to be destructively wrong, the audience is clearly expected to see the perspective that opposed him to be inherently good. Teabing saw the deception covering up the truth about Jesus' history as a call to action, an obligation to set the world free from evil. Both Sophie and Langdon witnessed the same deception, watched religious zealots kill to maintain it, and yet ended the story not being bothered by that in the slightest. Langdon acknowledges that people believing Jesus to be God leads to them doing evil things, but he isn't interested in doing anything about that. Religions offer guidance to people, he says. They help them cope and live better lives. Sophie, like the rest of her long-lost family, decides to keep the truth about her bloodline a secret. She and Langdon are good because, unlike Teabing, their understanding of Jesus doesn't alter how they live their lives in any way. While it's important to Dan Brown that we have no doubt in Christianity being doctrinally false and egregiously evil, it's just as important to him that we don't take that evil seriously. Our knowledge of Jesus should compel us to ignore and look down upon Christians while reinforcing what we already think. Religions should be examined and understood only insofar as they allow us to individually discard or domesticate them, and if that's the case, why should we bother sincerely evaluating them in the first place? Why not just believe whatever you want about Jesus and Christianity?
The only thing that matters is what you believe. History shows us Jesus was an extraordinary man, a human inspiration. That's it. That's all the evidence has ever proved. So again, I say, what matters is what you believe.
This historically, literarily, and morally embarrassing story wouldn't have become one of the best-selling stories ever made if it hadn't offered people justification for their pre-existing, uninformed, effortless apathy towards the Christian faith. Dan Brown sold people permission to ignore the Christian message, and it made him a fortune. Millions of people bought it without asking any questions, and still parrot its baseless claims to this very day. Even if you're not religious and are fairly sure that no amount of education on Christian history or doctrine could ever change that, I think we can all agree that nobody should be arriving at conclusions about religions or the people that practice them based on easily verifiable lies. An increasing number of people, just like Dan Brown, are trying their darndest to spread and monetize religious misinformation. And given the success of the Da Vinci Code, it's not a stretch to think that we're going to see a parallel increase in people answering questions with life-altering implications based on bad information going forward. Those apathetic towards truth will be doomed to a life pervaded by the dishonesty of others. If while watching this video, you've come to realize that you've been basing your beliefs about Jesus or Christianity on assumptions that might not be true, I'd encourage you to make sure what you're rejecting is genuinely Christian, if it's the best the faith has to offer. The question of whether Jesus is God is entirely too important for us to delegate it to those who've demonstrated they aren't interested in the truth. If you don't know where to start looking, consider giving one of these books a try. I have them listed in this video's description, along with one-sentence summaries above their affiliate links. If you're not interested in books, how about watching another video of mine, like the one I have linked on screen? And if you'd like to see more videos like this one, the easiest way to let me know that is by subscribing to the channel.